For 20 years, Eleanor carried trays of hot soup just to afford her daughter a magnificent wedding dress. She never expected her reward would be a cruel ban from her own son-in-law. "You are a stain on this family," he hissed. Could a humble waitress ever find a way to make an arrogant millionaire kneel? Hello, everyone. I am Casey. Have you ever felt your heart shatter when you realize the person you love most sees your sacrifice as nothing but a burden? The story I am sharing today is not just about money or status, but about the dignity of a mother who chose to stay in the shadows so her child could shine. Let us listen to Eleanor's heart in that fateful moment. I stood in the kitchen, the warm scent of cinnamon and apples from the freshly baked apple pie drifting through Michael's luxury penthouse. This was Sophia's favorite, the only thing that could truly calm her nerves before an event as big as her wedding next week. I felt a quiet pride as I adjusted my apron. My hands, rough and calloused from decades of hard work, felt out of place against the sleek marble countertops. But I did not care. I was there for my daughter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my late husband's old pocket watch. I carefully polished the glass with the corner of my apron. It was the only precious thing I had left from the days when we were a family, before the world got complicated and before he passed away. I wanted to give it to Michael today as a blessing, a piece of our history to carry into their new life. As I walked toward the study, the door was slightly ajar, and a conversation from inside made my blood turn to ice. Michael's voice was sharp and arrogant, nothing like the man I thought he was. "Sophia, you have to understand," he said. "Our guests are CEOs and politicians. We cannot have a woman who serves food sitting in the front row. It lowers our status. Your mother is just a stain on the velvet carpet of this ceremony." I stood frozen, my hand hovering near the door handle. "She has been busy with dirty plates for 20 years, Michael continued with a dismissive laugh. "Let her keep doing that. I will just give her a stack of cash to disappear on the wedding day. It is the best for everyone." I waited for my daughter to defend me, to tell him he was wrong. I waited for her to say that my hands were only rough because they had carried her every step of the way. But there was only silence. That silence was a knife twisting in my chest. The pocket watch slipped from my trembling fingers. It hit the rug without a sound. But inside me, something shattered completely. My heart throbbed with a pain that felt like it was suffocating me. My hands were ice cold and shaking. I looked back at the kitchen where the pie still smelled of home, but the world had turned gray and hollow. I turned away, leaving the gift and my pride behind that closed door. In the shadows of the hallway, I realized I was no longer just a waitress. I had become a stranger in my own daughter's life. I came back to my cramped apartment in Queens, where the chaotic symphony of New York sirens and car horns usually felt like company. But tonight the noise was just a distant hum drowned out by the toxic echo of Michael's words. His voice was a poison seeping into my veins, making my heart tighten with a shock I had never known. I sat at my small old dining table, my hands trembling as I reached for the dented tin box that held my most important papers. Inside those pages were the scars of my life that had never truly healed. For 20 years, I had worked every single holiday at Antonio's restaurant, carrying thousands of heavy trays that left my back aching and my feet swollen. I looked at the old savings ledger, and the numbers stared back at me like cold accusations. $80,000 for Sophia's prestigious university tuition, $30,000 for the down payment on her first apartment, and just recently a check for $20,000 so she could have this lavish wedding. I used to think of those numbers as milestones of my love, But now I saw them for what they really were. I was nothing more than an ATM to them. A bitter pattern began to emerge in the silence of my kitchen. Sophia only called when she needed a little financial support. Her voice would turn as sweet as honey as she told me I was the only person she could trust. But when I was in the hospital alone with chronic back pain from standing too many hours, her response was a brief text saying she was too busy with Michael to visit. Michael was no better. He was always happy to accept the expensive gifts I bought for Sophia with my waitress wages. But he never once invited me to sit at his table when his high society friends were around. My sacrifice had not been met with love, but with a cold contempt. I had walked away from a promising acting career and every chance at my own happiness just so my daughter would never have to struggle. Now, in the eyes of my millionaire son-in-law, I was just a stain that needed to be covered up with money. My kindness had been taken for granted for far too long, and Sophia's silence was the final answer to all the years I spent exhausting myself for her. I slowly closed the tin box. The sharp pain in my chest transformed into a calm that was almost frightening. I was no longer the weak mother waiting for a scrap of affection. I stood up and looked into the yellowed mirror in my hallway and spoke to my reflection in a firm voice I had forgotten I possessed. Eleanor, from today, your life does not belong to them anymore. It is time to take back everything that is yours. This morning, the sunlight streaming through my window in Queens did not carry the usual heavy weight of urgency. For 20 years, that light was a signal to rush to extra shifts, to calculate tips, and to figure out how much more I could send to Sophia. But today, I woke up as the clock struck 8, a simple luxury I had denied myself for decades. There was no persistent ringing of a phone, no frantic mental spreadsheets of expenses. There was only me, sitting in a pool of quiet peace. I walked into my small kitchen and did something I had not done in a very long time. I reached for the bag of whole bean Colombian coffee I had treated myself to, ignoring the cheap instant powder I usually drank just to save every penny. I took my time brewing it, letting the rich aroma fill the air. Then, I decided to make blueberry pancakes, drizzling them with thick Vermont maple syrup, the kind of ingredients I used to save only for Sophia while I ate the scraps. The buttery scent and the tartness of the berries felt like a warm embrace for the room. I sat by the window, watching the busy world below, and savored every sweet bite. For the first time in 40 years, I ate breakfast without wondering if my daughter had eaten or if she needed more money for some fancy dinner. After breakfast, I spent the morning reclaiming my small living room. I reached into the bottom cabinet and pulled out my old, dust-covered record player. There was a faint crackle as the needle hit the vinyl, and then Frank Sinatra's voice filled the space. I found myself swaying to the rhythm of "Fly Me to the Moon," and my legs, which had been aching for so long from carrying heavy trays, suddenly felt light. I went to the glass wardrobe and took out my old velvet flower dress, the one I bought for my final Broadway audition and never had the heart to wear again. It still fit perfectly, almost as if it had been patiently waiting for me to become myself again. I picked up the phone, but it was not to check for a message from Sophia. I called Antonio. I did not ask for more hours. Instead, I asked him to walk with me through Central Park this afternoon. I told him I wanted to see the peony exhibition, and the sound of his deep, hearty laugh on the other end made me smile. I stepped out of my apartment and stopped at the flower shop on the corner, buying myself a bright bouquet of sunflowers. Walking through New York under the green canopy of trees, I felt like I was breathing a completely different kind of air, the air of a freedom I had lost for far too long. Have you ever been so busy worrying about your children that you forgot the taste of a decent breakfast for yourself? It took Eleanor 40 years to realize she deserved that small joy. Have you ever had a moment of awakening where you finally decided to live for yourself? Please share your story below. I am always here to listen and share with you. The telephone rang, its sharp chirping cutting through the quiet afternoon air on my small balcony in Queens. I was sitting there, nursing a cup of chamomile tea and watching the way the late Sunday sun caught the brickwork of the buildings across the street. I looked down at the screen and saw his name, Michael. In the past, seeing that name would have sent a jolt of pure anxiety through my chest. My heart would have started racing, wondering what I had done wrong or what new crisis my daughter was facing that only my checkbook could solve. It was a physical reaction, a tightening in my throat that made it hard to speak. But today, I took a long, slow breath. I felt the solid, cool grit of the balcony tiles beneath my feet and the steady weight of my own body in the chair. I was grounded. I calmly slid my thumb across the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Eleanor, hello. Sophia and I were just talking about you." Michael's voice came through, sounding so smooth and sweet, it was almost syrupy. I could practically see him in my mind, leaning back in his expensive leather chair in that glass office in Manhattan, wearing one of those smiles that never quite reaches his eyes. "We are so sorry you had to leave dinner early the other night. Sophia has been raving about you lately. She really misses that signature apple pie of yours, you know." He spoke with such easy charm, as if the cruel words he had whispered about a lowly waitress just a few days ago had never happened. He spoke as if he truly cared about an old woman living in a rent-controlled apartment. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, listening to the faint, rhythmic sound of papers rustling on his end, the sound of a man who was always closing a deal. I realized then that to him, I was just another negotiation. "You know, Eleanor, the Hamptons' wedding is getting so close now, and as with all big events, a few little things have cropped up," he began, his tone shifting into that persuasive, professional register he used to get what he wanted. "The florist just sent over a revised quote for the centerpieces, and it is about $5,000 more than we anticipated. It is a bit of a headache, honestly. I was going to just take care of it myself, of course, but Sophia mentioned how much you wanted to contribute something truly special for her big day. She thought this would be a beautiful way for you to be a part of the magic." He paused then, a calculated silence designed to let me jump in and offer the money, just like I always did. He expected me to dive into my savings, to hand over the tips I had spent years standing on my tired feet to earn, just to keep the peace and see a smile on my daughter's face. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the slight bitterness of the herbs linger on my tongue before I spoke. "Michael, it is certainly unfortunate to hear about the unexpected costs," I said, keeping my voice level and polite, but stripped of its usual warmth. "However, I have actually made other plans for my savings. I won't be able to cover the cost of the flowers. Perhaps you should look into adjusting the floral budget, or simply pay for them yourself if they are that vital to the image you want to project for the guests." The silence that followed was so sudden and so heavy I could hear him catch his breath on the other side of the line. The mask of the perfect son-in-law was beginning to crack. His voice changed instantly. Gone was the sweetness, replaced by a sharp, biting edge of malice. "Eleanor, are you really going to do this? Are you really going to make things difficult for Sophia right now?" He was using his favorite weapon, guilt. He started talking about how much I had sacrificed for her over the years, implying that stopping now was some kind of betrayal of my role as a mother. He told me Sophia would be heartbroken if she knew her own mother cared more about a few $1,000s than her happiness on the most important day of her life. He was trying to make me feel small, trying to make me feel like a failure. I gripped the phone tightly, but not out of fear. I gripped it because I had to stop myself from laughing at the sheer pathetic nature of a man who could only measure love in the form of a signed check. I have made my decision, Michael, and there is really no need to discuss this any further, I said, cutting him off with a finality that felt like slamming a door. I hope you both have a pleasant evening. I pressed the end call button before he could get another word out. A wave of confidence, something I hadn't felt in decades, surged through me. It started in my chest and spread all the way to my fingertips. I stood up and looked at my reflection in the glass of the sliding door. I saw Eleanor, the woman who had carried the weight of everyone else's expectations on her back for 20 years. I saw her stand a little straighter as she realized she had just put the first part of that burden down. And that feeling of lightness was worth more than any tip or bonus I had ever received in my life. After that phone call, I knew Michael wouldn't let it go. He was the kind of man who viewed a no as a personal insult to his towering ego, a smudge on his perfectly polished world. I tried to lose myself in the rhythm of the restaurant, the familiar comfort of Antonio's place where I had spent 20 years of my life. But every time the bell above the door chimed, my heart skipped a beat, a cold flutter of dread rising in my throat. The NYC lunch rush was in full swing, a chaotic symphony of silver clinking against porcelain, the low hum of 100 conversations, and the rich, heavy scent of slow-simmered marinara. Then, the air in the room seemed to curdled. The heavy oak door swung open with a violent force that silenced the nearest table. Michael stepped in, his $1,000 tailored suit looking entirely out of place against the worn wooden floors and checkered tablecloths. He didn't look at the hostess. His eyes, burning with a cold, manic light, scanned the room until they locked onto me. His footsteps were heavy and rhythmic, echoing like a hammer against the floorboards as he marched toward me. I felt my breath hitch, my lungs tightening as if the oxygen had suddenly vanished from the room. "Who do you think you are, hanging up on me?" Michael roared before he even reached my station, discarding every ounce of the charming son-in-law persona he had worn like a mask. He slammed his hand down on a wooden table near me, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. The entire restaurant went bone-dry silent. I could see the shock on the faces of my regulars, people who had known me for years. "Sophia is at home in tears because of your disgusting selfishness. What are you doing? Hoarding that filthy money, planning to rot in this pathetic hole for the rest of your life." Every word he spat was laced with a venomous contempt, treating my profession as if it were a contagious disease. I struggled to keep my voice from shaking, to maintain the dignity I had spent a lifetime building. "Michael, this is my place of work. If you have something to say, we can speak later," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he wouldn't stop. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh and turned to the crowded room, gesturing toward me like I was a museum exhibit of failure. "Look at her. Look at the wonderful mother of the bride, a lowly waitress trying to sabotage her own daughter's happiness over a few $1,000s. He stepped closer, his expensive, suffocating cologne filling my senses, a scent that felt as fake as his smile. "You are a servant, Eleanor. Don't ever delude yourself into thinking you have a voice in my family." A surge of anger, one I had suppressed for decades, finally broke through the dam. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was a cold, steady current of electricity running down my spine. I set my tray down on the counter and looked him dead in the eye, refusing to shrink away. Your family? Michael, you are marrying my daughter. You didn't buy my life. The money I have is built on 20 years of sweat, tears, and a sacrifice you couldn't possibly understand. It isn't there to polish your hollow high society image. I spoke every word with a terrifying clarity, and for a split second, I saw him blink, his confidence wavering. You dare! He hissed through clenched teeth, his face turning a dark mottled red. He spun around toward the bar where Antonio was already moving toward us, his face a mask of quiet fury. Hey, owner, do you know what this old woman is doing? She's insulting a customer. I have enough friends at City Hall to shut this pathetic grease trap down in a heartbeat if I wanted to. Do you really want to lose your entire career over a senile waitress? The threat hung in the air like a noose, making my chest ache. He was attacking the only thing I had left, my work, and the people who were actually my family. Antonio stepped between us, his thin shoulders trembling with indignation, but his voice was like iron. Sir, here we sell food and respect. You have money, but you do not have the right to humiliate my staff. Leave now, before I call the police. Michael laughed then, a wild, echoing sound that felt like a threat in itself. He pointed a finger directly at my face. Fine. You want to play it this way? Don't even think about showing up at the wedding. You are officially erased from Sophia's life. Enjoy your freedom in your poverty. He spun on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind him with a finality that left the room in a bitter, ringing silence. I stood there, my legs feeling like they were made of water. Every ounce of strength I possessed seemed to have been sucked out of the room along with Michael. My ears were ringing, and though the low murmur of the customers started up again, I couldn't hear them. I felt like I had just survived a hurricane, one that had trampled my pride and threatened my very future. I looked at my hands. They were shaking so violently I had to hide them in the folds of my apron. Had I just destroyed everything? Had I truly lost my daughter forever? Antonio placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. Eleanor, you did the right thing. Don't let that man break you. I took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that were threatening to spill over. I couldn't cry here, not now. I looked around the restaurant, the place that had sheltered me for 2 decades, the scarred wooden tables, the familiar smells, the worried eyes of my friend. This was my reality. Michael might have money and power, but he couldn't steal the truth of who I was. I straightened my apron, wiped my eyes, and looked at Antonio. I'm okay. We have customers waiting. A bone-deep exhaustion settled over me, but deep inside, a tiny seed of resilience began to take root. This confrontation wasn't the end. It was the start of a battle I wasn't allowed to lose. Michael thought he had backed me into a corner, but he didn't realize that a mother who has already felt she's lost everything has nothing left to fear. I wouldn't just stand by and let his arrogance ruin my daughter's life. Tonight, I won't cry. Tonight, I start a plan. That night, after Michael stormed out of the restaurant leaving a trail of poisonous threats behind him, I did not cry. I sat in the darkness of my Queens apartment, watching the distant, blurred lights of the New York City skyline. The trembling I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a strange, cold clarity that settled deep in my bones. Michael thought he could use his power and his money to crush me like a bug on a sidewalk. But he had forgotten one fundamental truth. I had survived the harshest years of my youth, working double shifts and navigating a cutthroat city alone to raise my daughter. I knew exactly how to survive, and this time, I wasn't just going to endure. I was going to protect myself. The next morning, I woke up well before my alarm, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. I brewed a large pot of dark Colombian coffee, the aroma acting as a sharp reminder of the alertness I needed. I spread every single financial document I owned across the dining table. For years, I had allowed Sophia's name to stay on secondary accounts and let her use credit cards linked to my hard-earned savings so she could handle the essentials. Looking at the statements now, I realized I had unintentionally fed a monster of dependency. I picked up the phone and called the Chase Bank branch in Manhattan, the one where I still held a private account from my acting days, a small corner of my life that remained untouched and unknown to anyone else. At the bank, I sat across from a young, polite representative who looked at my worn hands and then at the balance in that old account with a hint of surprise. I requested the immediate removal of Sophia's name from all joint accounts and ordered the cancellation of every linked credit card. I changed every password and security question. When the representative asked if there was a specific reason for the sudden change, I simply gave her a small, tight smile and told her that it was finally time to teach my daughter the true value of independence. Watching those digital links disappear from the screen felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. It wasn't a punishment, it was a liberation for both of us. I also directed a portion of my life savings into a protected trust, ensuring that even if Michael tried to drag me into a legal battle, he wouldn't be able to touch the core of my security. My next move was about protecting Antonio. I could not let his kindness be the reason his livelihood was destroyed by Michael's arrogance. I traveled into the West Village to meet an old friend, a retired lawyer who had helped me navigate theater contracts back in the day. We sat in a cramped, quiet cafe where I laid out the situation. His eyebrows shot up as I described Michael's threats. He told me Michael was playing a dangerous game and that we needed to build a shield. Together, we drafted a formal agreement to protect Antonio's restaurant and began documenting every instance of Michael's public harassment and threats. Knowing I had a legal barrier between my friend's business and Michael's malice brought a sense of safety I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. But the most important defense line wasn't built in a bank or a lawyer's office. It was built inside my own soul. I went home and stepped into the small, dusty storage closet at the back of my apartment. I reached under the bed and pulled out a heavy, old wooden chest secured with a rusted padlock. Inside were the remnants of a life I had tucked away to become a useful mother. I looked at the yellowing film scripts, the black and white headshots from my Broadway days, and the posters where my name, Eleanor Vance, was printed in bold, elegant letters. I looked into the eyes of the woman in those photographs. She was radiant, hungry for life, and utterly fearless. I ran my fingers over the silk of a midnight blue dress I had worn to the premiere of my most successful film. 20 years of carrying trays and saying, "Yes, sir," had made me forget who that woman was. I had become accustomed to bowing my head and blending into the background. But as I held that dress, I realized the woman in the photos didn't know how to be a servant. She knew how to command a stage and how to hold the attention of a room. Michael could try to humiliate the waitress, but he had no idea how to handle Eleanor Vance. I realized that despite his money, he could never erase the grace and the skill that had been forged through 1,000 hours of performance. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading old lines aloud, letting the resonance of my voice return. I practiced my posture, standing tall with my chin up, rediscovering the mysterious, knowing smile that had once been my trademark. I no longer saw a tired, broken woman in the mirror. I saw an actress preparing for the most vital role of her life, a mother with dignity who would not be moved by the storm. I began making a list of what I needed for Sophia's wedding day. I wouldn't be going there to beg for a seat at the table. I would be going there as a presence that could not be ignored. I called Antonio that evening to tell him the news. I told him to keep running the restaurant exactly as he always had, and that I had taken the necessary steps to keep the city officials away. The sound of his relief through the phone warmed my heart. We even talked about a new, refined menu for the coming weeks, something elegant that reflected the rebirth I was feeling. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. I had Antonio. I had my history. And most importantly, I had myself back. Every action I took now was measured and calm. I bought high-quality skincare to revive the glow in my face that had been dulled by kitchen steam. I started walking in the park every morning, building my physical strength and my resolve. I stopped looking at the guilt-tripping texts from Sophia and the missed calls from Michael's office. I knew my daughter was being manipulated, and I knew the only way to save her was for me to be unshakable. My fortress was built not of stone, but of self-respect, and a love that refused to be trampled. As the sun set over New York again, I stood by my window with a glass of wine. Michael might own skyscrapers, but I owned my story and my soul. He thought he had successfully banned me from the wedding, but he had no idea that I was planning an entrance he could never have scripted. The waitress had finally left the building, making room for Eleanor Vance to take her final bow. I felt a sense of control and security that was absolute. I was ready. The bell at Antonio's restaurant chimed with its familiar light rhythm, but today it did not carry the usual heavy weight of a long and exhausting shift. I stood behind the bar, my hands moving with practiced ease as I polished glass after glass, but my soul felt entirely different. I was no longer that waitress bowing her head in silence, waiting for a scrap of recognition or a few extra dollars to send away. I was a woman standing firmly on my own 2 feet, anchored by a new sense of purpose. Antonio walked over to me holding a thick cream-colored envelope in his hand. His face, weathered by years of hard work in this city, held a look of unwavering determination that I had rarely seen before. "Eleanor, I have something for you," he said, his voice sounding as deep and comforting as an aged glass of red wine shared between friends. When I opened that envelope, my heart tightened with an emotion so strong it nearly took my breath away. It was a list, a long handwritten list of names, the regulars of this restaurant who had seen me every single day for 20 years. Beside their names were messages of encouragement, brief but powerful. Among them was the bold signature of Mr. Henderson, a quiet man I knew only as a loyal patron, but who turned out to be a board member of the very exclusive club where Michael was planning the wedding. Antonio took my rough, tired hand in his grip steady and warm. "You did not just serve these people food, Eleanor. You listened to their lives and you shared their sorrows for 2 decades. They respect you more than you know," he whispered. He told me that after witnessing Michael's public outburst the other day, the customers had decided to act together. Mr. Henderson had sent a message saying that if I needed any assistance at all to attend that ceremony as an honored guest, he was more than ready to intervene on my behalf. For the first time in so many days, a genuine radiating warmth spread through my chest. I realized in that moment that the true value of a person is never found in a bank balance or a flashy title, but in the quiet marks of kindness they leave in the hearts of others over a lifetime. The suffocating feeling of being alone in this fight vanished in an instant. I looked around this small restaurant, the place Michael had called a shabby, pathetic little corner, and it looked like a shimmering cathedral of friendship to me. The support from Antonio and these friends was not just a resource, it was a firm confirmation that I deserved respect. I did not need to beg Michael for the privilege of seeing my own daughter. I would go there with the dignity and the strength of a community that truly loved me. The sharp pain of betrayal was still there, of course, but now it was wrapped in an infinite protective sense of gratitude. My dear friends, in those moments when we feel most hopeless, help often comes from the people we least expect. Have you ever received an unexpected kindness that helped you stand up after a storm? Please share those stories with me below so we can all see that this world is still full of kind hearts. Your words might be the exact comfort someone else needs to hear tonight. The notification chime of a new email sounded sharp and cold in the quiet of the small office tucked behind Antonio's kitchen. Antonio looked at me and gave a small encouraging nod as I reached for the mouse. It was the message I had been waiting for from my old lawyer friend in the West Village. As the attachments downloaded, I felt a heavy weight in my chest, like I was standing before a rusted door leading into the darkest basement of a beautiful mansion. I took a deep breath and began to read. Each page that appeared on the screen felt like a physical blow to my face. Michael had spent months bragging about his million-dollar real estate projects in Manhattan and the skyscrapers that supposedly carried his name. But the reality staring back at me in black and white was a nightmare of debt. His corporation was bleeding dry, and he was drowning in high-interest loans from reckless investments in cryptocurrency and casinos in Atlantic City. I whispered a prayer as my hand shook while scrolling through the financial ruins. Those cruel words he used to call me a stain on the family were nothing more than a smokescreen to hide the disaster he was standing on. He didn't look down on my job as a waitress because it was lowly. He feared my integrity because it was a mirror that showed him exactly how pathetic he truly was. A wave of pure disgust rose in my throat as I reached the files regarding Sophia. He had secretly convinced my daughter to sign a series of power of attorney documents and joint loan agreements under the guise of preparing for their family future. My poor child had been so blinded by love that she didn't realize she was signing a death warrant for her own financial life. Michael didn't just want me out of the wedding to save face. He needed to isolate Sophia from the only person who might recognize the patterns of financial abuse in those numbers. He needed my savings and the image of a prestigious family to secure even more debt to keep his lies afloat for just one more month. I remembered the way he used that fake sweetness to borrow money from me for the wedding. It turned out that the $20,000 I had sent to Sophia was immediately diverted to pay off overdue interest on a personal debt he had hidden from her. He measured our family bond in checks and balances, because he was the one with a noose of debt tightening around his neck. His panic at the thought of me sitting in the front row wasn't about my apron. It was because he knew I might run into his old business partners, people he had cheated and dodged for years. "Eleanor, look at this," Antonio said, pointing to a scanned photograph buried deep in the lawyer's report. It was an old professional ban and a list of complaints for market manipulation from another state, dated before Michael moved to New York and changed his name. The man my daughter called her fiancé, the successful businessman the high society was applauding, was actually a professional con artist trying to pull off one last score before the floor fell out from under him. A cold chill ran down my spine. This was no longer just about a mother being banned from a wedding. This had become a rescue mission for a life. I sat back and wondered how much Sophia actually knew. I realized the answer was likely nothing at all. She was still living in a dream of royalty and status with a man she thought was a genius. Her silence and her betrayal of me in that hallway hadn't been born out of hate. but because she had been completely brainwashed by the illusions Michael had crafted. My heart broke for my foolish child. I had carried heavy trays for 20 years so she could be educated and refined, only for her to fall straight into the jaws of a wolf wearing a tailored suit. The truth was finally laid bare. Every piece of the puzzle, from his insults and threats to the way he tried to throw money at me to make me go away, was a move made by a man backed into a corner. He wanted me gone because I was the greatest threat to his carefully constructed lie. A waitress mother might not have political power, but she has an intuition and a protective instinct that cannot be bought or broken. That was the one variable Michael never bothered to calculate. I closed the laptop and leaned back into the worn chair of the office. The initial shock had finally faded, leaving behind a resolve that felt like cold iron. I was not going to stand by and watch my daughter fall into that abyss. Michael thought he had won when he banned me, but he didn't realize that the truth is a kind of light that no darkness can hide forever. I looked at Antonio, who was watching me with a look of deep understanding. He asked me what we were going to do next. I felt a smile touch my lips, a smile that my old directors on Broadway would have recognized instantly. It was the look of a lead actress right before she flips the script on the villain. "I am going to that wedding, Antonio," I said as I stood up and straightened my collar. "But I won't be going as a tired old woman looking for pity." I felt the strength of Eleanor Vance rising up within me, stronger than it had ever been. I am bringing a wedding gift that Michael would never expect. The absolute truth. It is time for that bad actor to finally take his bow and leave the stage. Tonight, I will prepare for the most important performance of my life. It will be a ceremony where real dignity is finally honored, and where those who hide behind lies will finally pay the price for their own arrogance. After the truth about Michael was finally laid bare, I did not feel the sharp sting of anger anymore. That initial disgust had given way to a vast, hollow space in my chest as I returned home. My small apartment in Queens felt strangely larger tonight under the cold, silver glow of the New York moon. I reached for the small velvet box where I had carefully placed my late husband's pocket watch after picking it up from Michael's cold floor. I sat down on the windowsill, letting the moonlight trace the rough calluses on my hands that had served so many for so long. I clicked open the watch, and its steady, rhythmic ticking was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. This was Arthur's wedding gift to me, the man who loved me when I was a rising star on Broadway and stayed by my side when I traded the stage for a waitress apron to provide for our daughter. Arthur used to say that I was a diamond, and even if I was buried under the soot of a kitchen, I would always find a way to shine in my own way. I pressed the cold glass of the watch against my cheek, and for a moment, the familiar scent of oak and tobacco from my memories of him seemed to wrap around me like a warm, protective coat. "Arthur, did I do something wrong?" I whispered into the darkness. I remembered the nights we spent together at this very wooden table, counting every penny for Sophia's college fund while the city slept. Arthur worked himself to exhaustion at the shipyard to make sure she could have the life of status she wanted. We gave her every luxury we never had, but perhaps in our love, we forgot to teach her how to see the true value in the hands that built her world. I felt a sudden, warm energy spread through my palm, the one holding his watch. It felt as if Arthur were standing right behind me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder and telling me that I was not alone in this fight. The image of Michael dismissing this watch as cheap junk flashed in my mind, but it did not hurt anymore. I gave a bitter smile. realizing that a man who only uses money to measure the world could never understand the weight of a lifelong promise. My 20 years of sacrifice were not a stain to be hidden. They were a great love song I had written for my family with my own life. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror, and my eyes were no longer those of a tired waitress. They held the sharp, calm gaze of Eleanor Vance, a woman who had survived every storm life could throw at her. I tucked the watch into my pocket, right against my heart. An incredible peace settled over my mind as Arthur's strength was passed back to me. I was no longer afraid of the loneliness or the threats. Tomorrow, I will walk into that ballroom not with hatred, but with the steady resolve of a woman protecting her family legacy. I will show Michael that while money can build skyscrapers, only love and dignity can build a person. Tonight, I sleep well, knowing Arthur is watching over my dreams. Friday morning in New York arrived with a sky as heavy and gray as a sheet of lead. I had barely stepped through the door of the restaurant when I saw them. Two men in stiff, charcoal-colored suits standing near the host stand with clipboards held like shields. Antonio stood across from them, his face pale and his hands gripping the edge of the bar so tightly his knuckles were white. I knew instantly what was happening. Michael had made his move. He wasn't going to wait for the wedding day to settle our score. He wanted to crush me right here, in the place I called home. And he was willing to destroy my friends to do it. One of the men spoke in a voice that was as cold and clinical as a hospital hallway. He asked if I was Eleanor Vance, and if the man beside me was Antonio Rossi. He introduced them as inspectors from the city's Department of Health and Business Licensing. He claimed there had been an emergency complaint filed regarding serious food safety violations and suspected tax fraud at this establishment. He told us they had an order to temporarily suspend our operations for a comprehensive audit. Every word felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to find air. Michael was using the one thing he believed in more than anything, the cold power of a system that could be bought. He knew this restaurant was Antonio's life, and he knew it was the only fortress I had left. The door opened again, and Michael stepped inside, moving with a slow, rehearsed arrogance. He walked over to the inspectors, stopping to adjust his gleaming Rolex as if he were preparing for a photo shoot. He looked at me with a smirk that was full of a jagged, quiet malice. "Hello, former mother-in-law?" he said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily kindness. "I told you before that you couldn't win this. In a city like New York, your little sense of pride doesn't mean a thing. One phone call from me is worth more than 20 years of your life spent carrying trays." I felt a surge of indignation burn through my veins, but I forced my breathing to stay steady. He was trying to draw me into his drama, trying to make me play the victim in the script he had written. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I didn't move an inch. I stepped closer to him, looking him directly in his cold, shallow eyes. "You actually think a few favors and connections can hide the ruin you are standing on, Michael?" I asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin, professional folder that my lawyer friend had meticulously prepared. I turned to the inspectors, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. I told them I respected their work, but suggested there was something else they needed to see. I placed the folder on the wooden table between us. I explained that it contained evidence of bad debt and failing assets belonging to Michael's real estate firm, which was already under a quiet investigation for market manipulation. More importantly, I pointed out the documented evidence of illegal wire transfers from my daughter Sophia's personal accounts into Michael's offshore funds, transfers meant to evade taxes and hide his own insolvency. Michael's face shifted from a look of triumph to one of pure, shaking shock. He turned a dark, sickly shade of red, and lunged for the folder, but I was faster. I pulled it back, my movements sharp and controlled. "You forgot who I was, didn't you, Michael?" I asked him. I told him I had lived among the wolves of Hollywood long before he ever learned how to tie a silk tie. He was trying to attack our livelihood, so I decided to show him how the system of truth actually operates. I informed him that I had already sent copies of these files to the Internal Revenue Service and the district attorney's office earlier that morning. I told him the authorities would be very interested to know how he was valuing his debts by manipulating a young woman and an elderly waitress. I told him if he wanted to close this restaurant, he should be prepared for the doors of a prison cell to open for him first. Michael began to tremble, his eyes darting toward the inspectors, who were now looking at him with a very different expression. The man they thought was a powerful ally was suddenly a liability. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it might snap. Antonio stepped forward then, his shoulders straight and his voice echoing with a quiet power. He invited the inspectors to check his kitchen, telling them he had nothing to hide. But then he requested that they ask Michael to leave immediately, as he was interfering with our legal business. One of the inspectors looked at Michael and told him in a very serious tone that he should probably come with them to clarify a few points regarding his original complaint. He noted there seemed to be a significant conflict of interest. Michael was led out of the restaurant, his arrogant posture completely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked look. As soon as the door closed behind them, I sank into a wooden chair, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The anger that had sustained me was gone, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I had won this particular battle, but I knew Michael was now a wounded animal, and he would be more dangerous than ever before. I looked at the folder on the table. It was my shield, but it was also a heavy burden. It was the evidence that would ultimately bring down the man my daughter thought she loved. "Eleanor, you were incredible," Antonio said as he brought me a glass of cold water. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. A new kind of resilience had taken root in my soul. I wasn't just protecting a small bistro in Queens. I was protecting the truth and my daughter's entire future. If I had to be seen as a ruthless woman to save her from a life of lies, then I was ready to accept that role. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about who would be the one standing when the lights finally went down. I looked out the window as the rain began to fall in heavy, steady curtains. The wedding was tomorrow. Michael believed he had pushed me into a corner, but he didn't realize that he was the one standing on thin ice that was already cracking. I was going to the Hamptons, and I wasn't going as a waitress who had been cast out. I was going as the one who would deliver the final judgment on this entire dishonest play. Eleanor Vance was ready for her most important performance. A mother who has nothing left to fear is the most powerful person in any room. "Hey everyone." Michael used his power to oppress Eleanor, but she fought back with the truth. "Have you ever been bullied by someone in a position of power? What did you do to defend yourself? Leave a comment sharing your story, or simply leave a heart to show your support for Eleanor's resilience. Casey would love to hear your thoughts." The train ride from Penn Station was a steady hum of metal against track as it carried me toward the Hamptons, where the most magnificent seaside estates were preparing for the most expensive parties of the season. Inside my leather handbag, the folder containing every piece of evidence regarding Michael's financial crimes sat perfectly still, but felt as heavy as lead against my side. I stared out at the passing landscape as the lush green fields of Long Island blurred into an emerald streak against the afternoon sky, and I realized that my heart was no longer jumping with the familiar tremors of fear. I understood with a quiet certainty that every mile we crossed brought me one step closer to the final moment where every lie Michael had told would have to come to an end. I chose to check into a small and quiet room at a historic motel several miles away from the resort because I needed a sanctuary to prepare my body and my spirit for the performance of a lifetime. I carefully hung the navy blue silk dress on a wooden hanger and watched as the high-quality fabric caught the fading light of the afternoon, radiating a deep and silent elegance that was a world apart from the rough and faded waitress uniform I had worn for the last 20 years. I moved with a slow and deliberate pace as I began to remove the exhaustion from my face, applying a cooling mask and starting the complex cosmetic routine I had mastered decades ago in the cramped dressing rooms of Broadway. Each stroke of the brush and each layer of fine powder felt like I was slowly waking up a powerful and confident woman who had been buried under the gray ash and grease of a restaurant kitchen. I looked down at the thick envelope resting on the small desk, which held not only the proof of his debts, but also a copy of the secret prenuptial agreement Michael had manipulated to strip Sophia of her rights. My chest felt a familiar tightness as I thought about how my daughter would likely break down when she finally saw the truth about the man she had promised her life to. I questioned for a brief moment if it was too cruel of me to shatter the happiest day of her life in front of everyone she knew. But then I remembered the way Michael had looked at me with such cold contempt, and the way Sophia's silence had felt like a physical wound. I realized then that I was not actually destroying her happiness, but instead I was smashing the gilded cage of lies that was threatening to swallow her whole life. A mother who truly loves her child is one who is brave enough to allow that child to feel a temporary pain if it means saving their soul from a lifetime of misery. I reached into my bag and pulled out my pearl necklace, the very last piece of jewelry I had refused to sell even during our most desperate years of poverty. And the cool weight of the stones felt incredibly solid and grounding against my skin. I applied a light mist of sandalwood and rose perfume, which was my signature scent from my days on the stage. And the fragrance acted as a final confirmation that Eleanor Vance had never truly died. I picked up my small evening clutch and did a final check of my phone to make sure it was fully charged and that my list of allies was standing by to intervene if Michael tried to resort to his usual tactics of intimidation or violence. The sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the Hamptons shore in the distance sounded exactly like the rhythmic applause of an expectant theater audience waiting for the curtain to finally rise. I walked out of the motel and stepped into a car that would take me to the exclusive resort where the ceremony was about to begin. As the car passed through the massive wrought iron security gates, I watched as expensive sports cars and women draped in designer silk made their way toward the grand ballroom. Michael clearly believed he had created a world where a woman like me simply did not belong. But he failed to realize that I understood the intricate rules and the high stakes of this world better than he ever could. I was not arriving as a guest to celebrate a union. I was arriving as the person who would restore the balance of the truth. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the main lobby, and I did not step out immediately, but instead, I sat there for a full minute, taking deep breaths and filling my lungs with the clean and salty air of the ocean. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window and saw sharp and knowing eyes, a mouth set in a line of absolute determination, and an aura of unmistakable grace. The woman who had been a waitress for 20 years was left behind on the streets of Queens. Standing in her place now was Eleanor Vance, the woman who was about to walk into that ballroom and take back the dignity that had been stolen from her by a man who didn't know the first thing about honor. I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel, the sharp and decisive rhythm of my high heels tapping against the red carpet as I walked toward the bright lights where Michael's long and elaborate play was finally coming to its end. I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Hamptons Resort, and the first thing that hit me was the sharp bite of the high-powered air conditioning and the overwhelming scent of thousands of white lilies. It was a suffocating kind of elegance. Everywhere I looked, there were crystal champagne flutes catching the light, and guests draped in designer silk and linen, all exuding a manufactured wealth that Michael had meticulously curated for this very moment. I stayed back for a while, blending into the shadows behind a massive stone pillar. I watched the scene unfold with a strange detachment, like an observer watching a play from the wings. This was the world that had tried so cruelly to erase me, and now I was here to see the final act. The altar was decorated like a perfect white dream draped in flowers that cost more than some people make in a year. Sophia stood there looking breathtaking in a Vera Wang gown that I knew was paid for by every extra shift I had worked and every tray of hot soup I had carried through the crowded aisles of Antonio's. Seeing my daughter from across the room made my heart ache with a deep physical pain. She looked like a beautiful porcelain doll, but there was a hollow look in her eyes as she stood beside Michael. He was grinning with a triumphant arrogance, like he had just successfully acquired a priceless trophy. He scanned the room, looking at the CEOs and New York power players as if they were his own personal kingdom. He had no idea that Eleanor Vance was standing just a few yards away, and that the curtain was about to fall on his carefully constructed life. Suddenly, Michael signaled for the string quartet to stop playing. He took a silver microphone and walked toward the center of the stage to give the celebratory toast. He started with the usual flowery words about success and status and finding a partner who matches one's ambition. But then his tone shifted into something sharp and poisonous. He pointed a finger toward the back of the room, toward the area where the service staff were gathered and where I was standing in the shadows. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the speakers with a forced clarity, "to truly reach the heights of success, one must know how to distinguish between those who build the world and those who were born only to serve it." He paused for dramatic effect. "For example, look at the woman standing there, a lowly waitress who happens to be Sophia's mother. She is a living reminder of failure and a stain we have had to accept simply to remind ourselves of the lower depths we have worked so hard to rise above." A deathly silence fell over the entire ballroom. I saw Sophia stumble back, her shoulders beginning to shake as she realized the depth of the cruelty of the man she was supposed to marry. The silence of the guests was heavy with a mix of shock and a sudden uncomfortable awareness. I did not cry, and I did not turn to run away. Instead, I slowly stepped out from the shadows. The sound of my high heels clicking against the polished marble floor was the only sound in the room. I walked directly toward the stage, and as I moved, the spotlight seemed to find me as if by instinct. I was no longer the humiliated waitress Michael had tried to describe. I was Eleanor Vance. I calmly took a silver tray from a nearby table and pulled out my phone, which I had already synced with the massive LED screens behind the altar. The first blow of the truth began. Instead of the romantic wedding photos, everyone expected the screens suddenly filled with a vibrant, high-definition clip from a classic black and white film. It was the high-stakes scene from The Last Waltz of Broadway. There I was, on screen decades younger, but with the same unmistakable fire in my eyes, playing a scene about the power of dignity and the strength of the human spirit. An older gentleman in the front row stood up suddenly and gasped. "My God," he whispered loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "That is Eleanor Vance. That is the Broadway star from the 80s. The murmur of the guests grew into a wave of recognition. These people whom Michael had been so desperate to impress were now looking at me with genuine awe, and looking at him as if he were a piece of uncultured trash who had just committed a social crime. Michael looked like he had been struck. His face went pale, and he tried to grab the microphone back, but I was already there, and I was much faster. My voice rang out through the room, sounding as steady and powerful as it had 40 years ago on a real stage. Michael, you are right about one thing I said. I am a waitress. And I am incredibly proud of it because every tray I carried helped build my daughter's education and her dreams. But tell me, Michael, what exactly is it that you have built? I pressed a button on my phone and the screen changed again. This time it was not a movie. It was a clear and undeniable display of Michael's bank statements showing his mounting debts, his frozen assets, and the clear evidence of the financial fraud he had committed using Sophia's name. I turned to the room and asked the guests if they would like to know whose money the creator of this world was actually using to pay for this very wedding. The entire ballroom erupted into a chaos of whispered outrage. The business partners Michael had called his friends turned their backs on him with looks of absolute disgust. Sophia didn't wait for another word. She ran down from the altar and collapsed at my feet, sobbing into the silk of my dress. Mother, I am so sorry, she cried. I was so blind to everything. I reached down and pulled her into my arms, feeling the warmth of a bond that had been broken for far too long. Michael stood frozen on that stage, isolated in the middle of a fake glory that was crumbling around him in real time. He was no longer a millionaire, and he was no longer in control. He was just a small and pathetic con artist who had been exposed by the very truth he tried to bury. Antonio and my lawyer friend walked into the ballroom, then accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. There was no need for a scene or for violence. Michael was simply taken by the arm and led out of his own wedding in front of every person who had mattered to his ego. The guests began to stand up, and they started to applaud, but they weren't applauding for a wedding. They were applauding for a mother who had fought for her dignity and for the life of her child. I took Sophia's hand, and we walked out of that ballroom together, leaving the noise and the broken pieces of Michael's lies behind us forever. When we finally stepped out onto the beach, the cool Atlantic breeze blew away the last of the suffocating scent of the lilies. The weight that had been on my chest for 20 years finally lifted. I unfastened the pearl necklace and looked at my daughter. Sophia looked back at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the girl I had raised instead of the stranger she had become. Mother, she said softly, you are truly the most powerful woman I have ever known. I knew in that moment that our lives were starting a completely new chapter. It would be a story written with the ink of the truth and held together by a self-respect that no amount of money could ever buy. The judgment had been delivered, and the victory belonged to a simple kind of goodness that Michael would never understand. We walked along the shore in the moonlight, finally free and finally home. A year has passed since that stormy afternoon in the Hamptons. New York has entered the Thanksgiving season once again, and the crisp air carries the scent of dried leaves and the distinct aroma of cinnamon wafting from the small bakeries lining the streets of Queens. I find myself in the familiar kitchen of Antonio's, but today I am not wearing the stiff black and white uniform of a waitress. Instead, I am wrapped in a soft, cream-colored sweater, holding a plate of freshly made cannoli. Out in the dining area, the sound of laughter from Sophia and Antonio fills the air as they decorate a Christmas tree a bit earlier than usual. Sophia has taken over as the executive manager of the restaurant. She no longer dreams of Michael's hollow ivory towers. Instead, She finds a deep and genuine joy in taking care of every guest, just as I did for 20 years. Michael has had to pay for his legal and financial crimes, but that is part of a different world now, one that no longer has any power over us. This evening, I have a small performance at a local community theater where I have started teaching acting to a group of passionate young people. I look at Arthur's pocket watch resting on the table, and its steady ticking feels like a heartbeat. I have come to realize that true happiness does not depend on where you sit at a high society gala. It is found in who you are sitting next to when the stage lights finally go down. I have reclaimed my name and my history, but more importantly, I have reclaimed my daughter and my own soul. It is a new beginning, one that came late in life, but feels more radiant than anything I have ever known. This is Casey. Listening to Eleanor's story, I am struck by a truth that is simple yet incredibly powerful. Your value is never defined by the balance in your bank account or the titles on your children's business cards. It lives in your integrity, in the honest sweat of your brow, and in the unconditional love you have planted throughout your life. To the mothers and grandmothers listening to this podcast, please never allow anyone, even those you love most, to make you feel like a stain, because you worked hard to raise them. Your rough hands are the very hands that built the future. Be proud of yourself, just as Eleanor was when she walked into that ballroom. Money can buy a fleeting kind of glamour, but self-respect and kindness are the lights that never go out. Did Eleanor's journey remind you of a moment in your own life? What is the biggest lesson you are taking away from this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I will be reading every single one as we work to heal the wounds in our hearts together. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing our next story with you.